during the Rwandan genocide, UN peacekeepers were left with very little materials to protect the people. They didn't have the kind of military infrastructure that was necessary to make sure that vulnerable people, didn't die. They were left helpless to watch as they could do nothing as people were plowed down in the streets. That is a world that we obviously regret. We should ultimately allow these institutions to hire out interventionists. There's three parts to this speech. Firstly, a bit of setup. Secondly, a point about why we get more intervention. And secondly, a point about why we get better intervention. Quickly, in setup. How is this going to operate? What is it going to look like? Largely speaking, we think it is humanitarian institutions like UN or states, probably states in the West, because these are the people with the greatest kind of stake and interest in these humanitarian crises, contracting out to PMCs like Blackwater. And I'm going to prove later on in this speech why each of those actors are likely to be good. But let's get into the meat of this debate, which is why we get more intervention. And the first thing I'm going to prove in this point is just what barriers exist for intervention now, and why these barriers are exclusive to the states, are not exclusive, and don't impede on the ability of these states and institutions to intervene. The first is the fiscal one, which is just that the UN has no real military infrastructure. It costs an enormous amount of money to develop weapons, to buy weapons, to store them, to maintain them, and that is just a huge amount of money that would have to sink into this as a necessary means. But secondly, there's a huge fiscal cost to going into conflict. That is just the US and Afghanistan and any other conflict which exists. And that's because you have to deal with deployment and you kind of have to control everything at all time, which proves when you as a state or as an actor are in full control of the kind of military operations, it is likely to be hugely expensive. Secondly though, the barrier that exists is popular support, right? People within these countries do not want to send away their children or their friends' children because they have a kind of emotional attachment to them, which means just kind of intrinsically and obviously, you don't want to send them away, you don't feel that kind of connection and attachment to PMCs who exist outside of that. But secondly, we would note an increasing trend of political isolationism, which is, I kind of note the backlash which exists in the US, because people are kind of unsure why they should be spending so much time and money in Ukraine, which is a problem that doesn't really impact their day-to-day lives. Thirdly though, I think the reason that a number of states are unlikely to intervene is just because putting their foreign boots on the ground is an incredibly scary move. Like it literally is just violating that nation's sovereignty and impeding on it with your own military. And secondly, I think it represents a high amount of commitment. Point to Afghanistan, where once they sent in those number of troops, they were unlikely and didn't want to pull them out just because of the huge sunk costs that exist there. Why necessarily does privatisation specifically overcome these barriers? Firstly, it is just far cheaper. Why? Because there are less organizational and infrastructural costs involved for these states and institutions. And the example I'm going to use is like a plumber, right? Like you hire out a plumber because that means that you don't have to A, buy the necessary pipes and tools to do the operation. You don't have to learn how to be a plumber, and you don't have to do out the necessary tasks. You just pay for the plumber to do their job, which is far, far cheaper, just I think intuitively, than the kind of huge amount of costs that are involved in doing everything in that process. And the next thing I want to prove is just that the UN has a large amount of economic power. Like states, in order to be involved, pay a huge amount of money. They just have an enormous nest egg. I think this is information that the average reasonable person knows. The UN is a powerful economic actor. Secondly though, this as a move is far less politically divisive. That is just because you have less emotional attachment to PMCs who you have never met and will never meet. But also, again, this is just a less scary move for the state. Why are all of these reasons necessarily a tipping point, i.e. why does this kind of opportunity outweigh all of the barriers that exist? The first thing I want to prove is just that these countries and these institutions wanted to help, and there are a few reasons why. Firstly, it's because the UN kind of gains its international power by doing things by promoting human rights and promoting democracy. It is kind of a necessary outcome of that then it must be seen to supporting those things. I think you should also probably just believe that the nature of the UN, the people within the UN, want to help, like they've dedicated their lives to kind of serving the common good of the world. But secondly, I think nation states want to help, and that's for the reason that often there is a huge amount of outrage when you see human rights crises, when you're watching the news or whatever, right? Like the amount of the backlash that existed when the Rwandan genocide, and people turned on the TV and saw huge humanitarian crises that they couldn't really do anything about. These governments want to help, but don't want to sink, no thank you, the huge cost that exists under the status quo. This policy would allow them to help. And the benefit that I want to prove here, and the way I'm going to do, is just to ask you to be imaginative. Like the comparative benefits of some intervention just means that less people die unnecessarily. Just means that people are able to protect themselves because now there are PMCs who are literally contracted to be there to make sure that they are safe and are able to go about their day in a normal and satisfactory way. The second thing I'm going to prove in this speech, and I'll take that Q&A in a second, is just why PMCs are likely to be better. Before I delve into that, yes?
Who do you think is most likely to be using these PMCs? we know, noting that it's particularly likely going to be Western powers?
Yeah, so probably actors, as I explained before, who care about human rights crises. Like, presumably the only actors who are going to sink money into this are the actors whose populations like, this is a terrible thing that is happening. I think the types of states that is likely to occur in are probably just like good ones, because these are the kinds of, like, A, there's a media reporting about how terrible this crisis is, but B, there's a kind of result and a kind of knee-jerk reaction from the people, which is like, we should do something about it. All of that then proves why we get more intervention and why that in and of itself saves lives, because the comparative is just nothing. But the second thing we're going to prove is why they're better. And the first thing I want to observe here is just that I anticipate a level of argumentation from OO about like accountability, a number of reasons to believe that this is comparatively more accountable. First, states don't want to criticize themselves, right? Like the US military doesn't want to go out and blast their own military force. They are more likely to do things like say, like you should probably blacklist this PMC because they do dodgy stuff. But secondly, note the format of organizational accountability, which is that military courts are incredibly internal, they're incredibly secret, they're incredibly like out of the public view. This is unlikely to be the case when these are kind of existing in the public sphere and kind of like public goods. And especially if it's the UN, we can probably expect the kind of courts that this takes place in are just the ICC, which are probably good ones. But secondly, note the nature of these institutions. Like, the UN wants to be spreading good messages. That's how they gain their authority. Imagine what happens if it turns out that the UN is bankrolling a terrible PMC, probably a bad look for them, have the incentive to make sure it's good. Why else are they better? Firstly, they just have the financial incentive to be. Like, their nature of competition means that you want it to be a successful PMC, otherwise you don't get hired out, which means you are just incentivized to make sure that your soldiers are the most professional. And the other accountability benefit there is that soldiers who are super skittish are the most likely to just kill random civilians because they're really nervous and don't know what to do in the field, at the point at which are incentivized to make sure that their workers know what they're doing. That's when you get the greatest amount of accountability, because people aren't like, oh my god, there's someone, better kill them. That doesn't exist in our world. Finally though, you just give a great amount of control to the local military forces within these states, which is to say, when you send your own military force, if you're the US, you kind of ruin the ability of local states to kind of have any autonomy. That changes with PMCs because there is more cooperation. Zoe will explain that more in her speech, so I'm incredibly proud to propose.
The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is just explain why peacekeepers currently are particularly effective and explain why they are far more accountable. So, why are peacekeepers particularly preferable to what this other team says? Or at least to start with, why they're sufficiently effective? The first thing is to address, I guess, what's told to us by opening government, which is that there have been instances in things like Rwanda where they haven't been effective. That's not sufficient, obviously, to prove they are ineffective in the majority of circumstances. We would actually point to those examples as why in recent years the UN peacekeeping forces have been particularly well funded and have been given extra resources because there was broad backlash and the UN was seen as ineffective when they weren't able to help in those circumstances. And obviously, if you want an empirical example of that, you can look at the increased funding and kind of help that they've done when going into places like Afghanistan and when going into places like Libya. So that's a reason to actually believe, like, per opening government's mechanism, this is like peacekeepers have been sufficiently increasing the amount of funding and access and capital they have access to perform their job sufficiently well. The second reason why this is true is that obviously in many instances these are ex-army individuals who undergo a serious amount of training from the UN anyway. They point to the fact that they have large amounts of budgets for this. They point to the fact that the UN, for example, wants to be sufficiently effective in these areas. It's unclear, obviously there's that. And the final thing is that there's, as I'll explain later, comparatively a huge amount of scrutiny on these organizations, which means that they need to do things like minimize the amount of instances in which things go wrong to ensure that these peacekeeping organizations actually function. That should suggest to you that they put them through a huge amount of training and they ensure that they function sufficiently well that they would not be seen as like worsening the problem, for example. What I'll do second in this speech is explain comparatively then why PMCs have absolutely no accountability structures. Before I do that though, I'll just address the attempts that opening government give to preempt this material. They say two things. The first thing they say is that states don't want to criticize themselves, but first of all, it's incredibly not unclear why that's true. Like there's huge amounts of partisan divide over whether or not the state itself is being seen as a bad actor, or whether or not even if the state is trying to do a good thing, it's their place to necessarily do so. Obfuscating that responsibility is an instance where states are probably likely to be less critical, but it's also unclear why individuals in these states would be less critical of their own government, for example, who they elect, as opposed to a private military contract. The second thing they say is that military courts are transparent. The first thing I would point out is that it's often very difficult to get private military contractors to courts in the first place because they often exist in independent jurisdictions, or they exist in jurisdictions like Russia where the state protects them because Russia heavily uses PMCs outside of this context. But the second thing to say is that their alternative explaining is ridiculous. It's things like the ICC, which is hugely backlogged, ineffective. But finally, why, if states were using this, would you ever take this to the ICC in the first place? Incredibly unclear how that mechanism functions. So, 4 reasons to believe why accountability structures of PMCs are absolutely terrible. The first is that PMCs would likely only take contracts in joint states if there weren't huge accountability restrictions put on them in the first place. The second thing is that, as I explained, often military courts are preferable, and there often aren't sufficient alternatives for paramilitary contracts. Third of all, the UN just has things like rules of engagement, and there's international law that dictates specifically how and when they are allowed to enter into conflicts, which creates stability and consistency in the ways in which this is applied, which is not true with PMCs. The final thing is that obviously they have to disclose things like combat logs, they have to disclose things like mission reports, which is obviously not true of private military contracts, because they exist and work for a variety of different people outside of what the instances that we're talking about in this debate, which means obviously it's within their own business incentive not to do this so they can maintain customers and maintain secrecy, which is often how they market themselves. What are the impacts of this analysis? The first thing it does is put a huge burden on the government bench to explain why they would act well in the majority of instances, not just in some instances, because in the instances where they start to act badly, there is absolutely no recourse that we can take. It will massively increase the amount of casualties, and there's very little ability to hold them accountable, which is a prima facie reason why you should believe they're not likely to act well in the majority of circumstances. But having explained why UN peacekeepers are sufficiently effective, it's not enough for this team to point out that private military contractors can do things. Their burden is to explain why they are so much more effective than the comparative option that we would risk, for example, hiring and using people that are not particularly effective, that are particularly rogue, and as I'm about to explain, will intervene in particularly harmful ways. So, let's get on to the second substantive contribution in this speech before I do point of information. No?
Sure. UN peacekeepers are effective up until the point something goes wrong. They just don't have the kind of military infrastructure to do anything about it. Can you please engage with those circumstances?
Okay, first of all, that's an assertion that's not proven in your case. I gave you a series of reasons to believe why they're particularly well funded per your analysis and why they're often ex-army officers. But second of all, I'm about to flip your entire case by explaining why they act badly, which is going to knock you out of the debate. So, why is intervention likely to be done in the majority of circumstances particularly badly? The first thing to just examine here is how they're likely to be deployed. And obviously, at the point at which states are doing this, states are likely to intervene in conflicts now that better reflect their own national interests, going into areas to, for example, prop up a government and fuck over rebel groups because they have specific interests with that country, to get things like access to national resources or to create stability in areas, for corrupt governments for the reasons I've just explained. And obviously this is likely to be done because first of all, you can just say it's peacekeeping. Second of all, you can get there's far less accountability now for all the reasons that I and opening government give, which would suggest to you that there's a far lower cost for states entering into the first place. You don't have to do things like use your own soldiers. You can enter areas where it's, for example, riskier, because you can just obfuscate all the harms of entering into conflicts in the first place to private military groups. But finally, obviously PMCs themselves will force governments to do things like legitimize their use by, saying, oh, well, we're propping up the interests of the nation. This is incredibly important. It's protecting our own national interests because there might be things like spillover conflicts, which just means that states have far greater purview to intervene in ways that are malicious and intervene in ways that are bad. So, let's then explain why they're likely to be bad actors when they intervene. But I would note here that what this explains is that even in some instances, if they do intervene for the purposes of humanitarian aid, that's not enough to outweigh the fact of what we've just explained, which is that you're greatly inserting paramilitary groups into areas to fuck over different people, to topple nations, for example, for the specific interests of states. But firstly, they're obviously likely to be incredibly ruthless. They use tactics like shock tactics and fear. Second of all, there's going to be absolutely no local support for this because it's seen as, for example, an intervention by state, which is likely to do things like fuel terrorism and increase the amount of conflict in the region in general, which wins on their metric by explaining that more people are likely to die. But they also just do things like, preemptively go out and mow down an area. Because it's easier to do that and you're less likely to lose soldiers going in and preemptively killing everyone in an area rather than safely, for example, taking a convoy through passages, which just means that there's way more civilian casualties. It means that they do things like break rules of engagement. And I would note the only thing that they say with respect to this is that, well, if you act badly, there's a competitive market. No, there's not. It's a monopsony. The OID knows that because paramilitary contractors are incredibly hard to establish because it's really hard to get good soldiers. The equipment, as they explain, is incredibly, expensive, right? For those reasons, this would result in more unnecessary conflict in the market.
that because Saddam Hussein was a dictator who was doing human rights abuses against his people, it would have been good to send Blackwater into Iraq. And we know exactly how that ended. These PMCs are literally not capable of doing things like stabilising a country, like nation building, like respecting the human rights that opening government themselves make the focus of their case. That is why it's a bad idea. Even if you believe that UN peacekeepers aren't perfect, they are at least vaguely accountable, they are at least vaguely trained, they don't go in all like heavily tattooed guys with guns blazing, trying to go beast mode on unarmed civilians. That is the reason that we very simply win open half. First question I'm going to ask briefly is, do we actually need this policy? Because OG's big impetus is, sometimes the UN fails to act, they point to like the Rwandan genocide, for example, as justification for such a big change. The first way we beat this is by giving a series of reasons to mitigate this, pointing out that in the post-Rwanda period, the United Nations reformed significantly. It significantly reformed the way it organised troops. It made it significantly easier for the Security Council to get an agreement on how to intervene. It significantly increased funding and training for peacekeepers. And as a result, the UN has been broadly a much better actor in terms of intervention ever since. That's why the Kosovo mission has been quite successful at stabilising there. That's why East Timor is now an independent country with its own elections. That's why South Sudan was able to break away from Sudan without it devolving into a full-scale ethnic genocide, which is to suggest that the international community, through the United Nations, is actually broadly okay at responding to these crises, even if it is not perfect, which means the burden on the government bench is just truly astronomical in this debate, but to be traded off against all the harms we give you about accountability, about the way these PMCs tend to engage in countries, particularly in the global south. The second thing I would note, though, is that obviously their benefit is 100% contingent on proving that governments are good actors, that PMCs are good actors, that they go in and actually make the situation better, and they are shockingly light on mechanistic work to actually do any of that. So, first substantive question I'm really going to ask in the speech is, what about the number of interventions? Because I know that opening government claim this as a benefit, but we actually flip this pretty easily. Because if you believe a couple of very simple premises, that PMCs tend to act pretty badly, that they influence the decision of governments with things like the military-industrial complex and subsequent decisions they make, if you believe that war is bad, then this is actually a harm if you get more interventions. Because we would suggest that, even in circumstances where human rights are being abused, it is preferable to have human rights abuses than to have war. Because that just tends to escalate the actions of that government that is doing the oppressing. It tends to enable other worse actors like ISIS or rebel groups to come onto the scene and start doing things like conscripting child soldiers. It tends to increase things like deaths and maimings from bombing. It means that you get more oppression of people's political rights when they get abducted and tortured for information. You get far more refugees getting displaced when whole cities are now bombed to the point of being uninhabitable. And that's the example that I give in my introduction, right? Iraq with weapons of mass destruction. Governments and PMCs are going to very cynically abuse this in order to justify further interventions, under the guise of human rights language, under the guise of doing humanitarian intervention, even when it's often actually not the case that this is what those countries want, even when it's often not the case that for the reason that Ben gives, that it's now very easy because of the fact that they have huge influence on things like lobbying of governments, when they have huge influence on things like political re-election campaigns and donations, when they're tied up in the language of national security in a way that's quite politically popular, it's very easy for organisations like Blackwater to justify these interventions and push governments to send them in so they can make money out of this situation as well. And that is the reason that we think there's a huge harm that there's going to win us the debate from opening opposition. You just very simply get more wars. And even if the trade-off for that is sometimes we allow human rights abuses to go on a little bit longer in terms of bad governments, that is obviously preferable to a war. That is obviously preferable to these countries being invaded, being looted, being destabilized for decades ahead. It's why Iraq is still not back on its feet. It's why Cambodia is probably never going to economically recover compared to the rest of the West. But secondly, even if you don't believe those mechanisms about why you get more frequent wars, you certainly get more destabilizing wars, because we tell you that these PMCs are sent in by Western governments, which means they're likely to act in ways that are much significantly less accountable. They nothing like the UN troops, which tend to be more demographically represented and similar to the countries they're sent into. They're more likely to commit acts of cruelty because they have less accountability, which spurs further cycles of things like insurgencies and terrorist recruitment campaigns and radicalizations. And they're more likely to just be extraordinarily violent, because as Ben tells you, they rely on things like shock and awe tactics and things like combating counterinsurgencies rather than conventional warfare between two equivalent armies, which means you're very likely to see particularly brutal violations of people's human rights. You're likely to see particularly brutal wars that destabilize more people, that cause more people to end up angry and joining the sort of terrorist groups that they're often sent to fight in the first place. But thirdly, we claim that even if you believe that it could technically suppress this threat or end the human rights violations, they now have to deal with the fact that you've got a PMC with no incentive, no experience, and no capacity to rebuild that country and make it stable again, make sure its political institutions are now developed in a way that only the United Nations is able to do, with its international legitimacy, with its degree of experts, with its actual political experience, and with its significantly greater level of resources. That is why the number of interventions and the quality of interventions get significantly worse on the government bench. That impact alone is enough, because we explained that more frequent wars that literally kill tens of millions, that displace even more, is going to be the biggest impact in this debate, bar none. Closing, what do you got?
No.
Opening?
You said you support sending UN peacekeepers. Why don't they destabilise the local environment in the same way?
Oh, they obviously destabilise it somewhat, but to a far lesser extent. Because firstly, there's higher barriers to sending them in, which means you're only likely to send them in good situations rather than in cynical ones where PMCs can be more likely to be weaponised, as Ben explains. But also secondly, they're much less destabilising because the UN has actual political legitimacy. It's an international body. Civilians on the ground recognise the UN symbol, whereas if the fucking Wagner group comes into your village, you're much less likely to listen to what they have to say, to obey their instructions. Let's talk then about the quality of intervention, because the mechanisms you get from opening government are just very, very weak. They say governments are good actors because the West cares about human rights, which is just hilariously untrue. These are the same countries that shut their borders to refugees, focus on their own economy, invade other countries under false pretenses. Trump wants to invade Iran, China is doing China things. China is not interventionist. No, talk to the Philippines, talk to India, talk to Myanmar, talk to Bhutan. China is very much interventionist. This is going to be weaponized by a hell of a lot of powerful countries with big PMCs they can turn to. But when they say that PMCs are good actors, all their mechanisms are also similarly weak. They say they're accountable, but obviously not, because even if military courts are private, at least they exist. There's some chain of command. You can hold them accountable and hold governments accountable, whereas PMCs, as we explained, often have immunity and secrecy clauses in their contracts, and they have large economic and political ties. Like Blackwater is an institution of the Republican Party. Wagner Group is part of the Russian government. Of course, they're not getting sympathized. Also, their claim is like, well, your government don't criticize themselves. Yeah, you're also not going to fucking criticize the guys you just hired to do your job and outsource to, because that just makes you look like a bunch of idiots. They say there's competition, but obviously OG's own mechanisms about why you need so many resources to do a big national scale intervention means there's only actually a very small number of very concentrated firms with the capacity to do this. There's very limited competition. They say they're skilled at killing people. They're trying to kill people, not to protect human life. They have no capacity at all to stabilize and nation build. They have no way to support the local population, and governments are much less willing to let them in, which means they're probably often going to have to fight their way in if they're perceived as a foreign invading mercenary force. This is a terrible idea. Sorry, Kat, don't know what the Adjudicators were thinking. Oh, Lord.
Is going to win this debate because we are going to broaden the scope of this debate and engage with it at its fullest extent. We are the side that minimises conflict because we are the side that provides short-term and efficient solutions to small states that allows them to resolve regional conflicts without having to deal with the massive bureaucratic burden of getting UN peacekeepers involved. We are the side that shortens conflicts. We are the side that saves lives. This was always going to outweigh any accountability material that opening bench could ever bring. I'm going to do a few things. I'm firstly going to explain why these groups are actually likely to be good actors. This is just going to be a series of logical reasons why, for financial reasons, you would not go out and do war crimes. I'm secondly going to explain how we get faster solutions to regional conflicts and why that is so important. And I'm finally going to explain how it's good when states don't send their own militaries because that's often actively destabilizing. So, firstly, why these groups are likely to be good actors, and this is going to get over the accountability question opening, because even if they were slightly less accountable than the UN peacekeeper troops, if they had a bunch of incentives to be good actors anyway, then you should not weigh accountability as highly. So, the frame for this is that obviously given that they are private groups, their main incentive is to make money. Therefore, there is a bunch of rational reasons why you are more likely to make money when you do this in a way that is efficient and it is not violent. Firstly, these groups are likely to be risk averse. That is to say, they don't want to have to replace their soldiers a lot, they don't want to have to replace all the equipment, they want to minimize costs. And the way that you do that is to avoid conflict escalation at all costs. It is far more efficient for you as a group if you go in and you get this conflict to end quickly with a minimal amount of lives lost, because you literally just save a bunch of money. So they're unlikely to make really bad decisions or cause a lot of violence that would make conflicts go on for longer. Compare that to state militaries, which often have far more political incentives and are often likely to just do as they're told or do whatever it takes to win at all costs without caring as much about the things that they lose along the way because they have much more resources to lose. Secondly, you have to deal with legal cases if you do bad things. These groups are still accountable to international law, but crucially, they're probably far less able to defend themselves than a state is able to defend themselves because they're much more and they don't have as many resources. They don't want to get sued by the states they intervened in. Thirdly, they care about their reputation. This is crucial because given that probably the biggest buyers of these groups are the US and are the UN, who notably care about things like not causing war crimes, particularly the UN, whose whole goal is, I guess, to keep the peace, etc. If you want to be hired by these actors who have fairly strong principles, then you would have to show yourself to be a group that is not super violent, is not doing really dodgy things, is not out there killing civilians, because there is going to be a competition between these groups, and if you are the group with a terrible reputation, you will not get hired. So, if you want to make money, you're likely to not do really dodgy things. And fourthly, to the extent that perhaps you could get hired by smaller scale, bad actors, I guess some pro-dictator or whatever, the amount of harm the groups are able to do in these contexts is probably just limited by the scale. And then again, the actors with the most money who are able to hire the most of these groups is the US and the UN, who are therefore the ones who are less likely to be doing dodgy things with them. Fifthly, states are likely to be accountable if they hire the groups to do bad things. They can also be tried in a court of international law. And sixthly, we would also just note that it's a bit of a weird push from OO that they're going to be bad at causing stability afterwards. We don't think these groups would be the ones who are like bringing that stability to the region afterwards. Obviously, that's still the UN. The peacekeeper soldiers themselves are not the ones establishing the new government. Obviously, that's the role of the UN diplomats who step in afterwards. Given the UN is hiring these PMCs, they're still going to do that on both fronts. So, I'm now going to explain how we get faster solutions to regional conflicts, which is the main extension here. What this is essentially to prove is that when smaller states are able to use this as a quick solution on a regional scale, they're able to fix the conflict without having to wait for the UN peacekeepers, and that is going to save so many lives. So, what do we think this looks like? We think this looks like, for instance, firstly, this looks like, say, neighbouring states hiring these mercenary groups to resolve conflicts within their region. Obviously, the incentive being you don't want instability in your region because that's not good for economies. Secondly, it looks like states hiring these to deal with terrorist groups within their own state, or sort of civil war situations that are going on where they want to be able to deal with this terrorist group. But thirdly and crucially, we think that this is likely to be a short-term solution, in that peacekeepers are probably going to come eventually on both sides, but this is able to provide something in the intermediate where you just give this money to the group and they can come in and get involved. What happens currently? Firstly, crucially, the UN is really slow. And note, this uses all of the mechanisms we get from OO because they have to go through all this bureaucracy, because they have to get the vote of all of the nations in the UN, because they have to prove all these barriers. This takes months. In those months, people die, and that is the biggest impact in this debate. But secondly, often when the UN gets involved, they have to do it on a small scale, they have to be conservative because they can't justify losing a lot of resources or peacekeepers because they're accountable to so many different countries all at once. They're likely to not provide an adequate scale of intervention. What happens in our world is that now neighbouring states have this immediate solution. They can hire this PMC. The PMC can get involved in that country, and we think that what happens is just firstly the threat of being able to have that PMC involved immediately is probably enough to stop that conflict and I guess sort of encourage the states involved to mediate treaties. Or secondly, you can just deal with that terrorist group much faster instead of letting them, I guess, take control of your country and kill villages, etc. You're just able to get in control of that much faster. And then thirdly, again, crucially, the UN peacekeepers troops are going to come in after a month or two. Sure, I'll take a quick point of voting.
Yeah, Blackwater was trying to be efficient and fulfill its contract when it used depleted uranium rounds on civilians in Fallujah in 2004 and remains the US government's preferred PMC partner. Your characterization of highly good actors is simply not true.
Well, sure, but the UN's obviously not going to hire that, given that that is now known about them. Obviously, they're going to make mistakes sometimes. These mistakes mean that they get less hired. It's an incentive to try and be as efficient as possible. So, why these groups are likely to be particularly good actors in these scenarios? Firstly, they are efficient. That is to say that because of, this is just a pretty basic capitalism argument, but because they're in competition with other groups, they're likely to be always training, they're likely to be wanting to try and improve and do things quickly because they want to have a competitive advantage. Given the stuff I already told you about how they want to, not why it's a good thing to have a good reputation, they're unlikely to do this through really dodgy shortcut means. They're likely to just, I guess, care a lot about being really good and training really well. Whereas on the comparative, the peacekeepers obviously have no other competitors. So there's actually not really any incentive for them to put a lot of money or time into training. They're likely to just sort of do the bare minimum that they need to do. So they're just likely to be good at their job and deal with things quickly. But also because, crucially, they can get in so fast. Why this material is debate winning? When conflicts are prolonged, people die. That is the biggest impact that you have to understand in this debate. If we are able to get in and provide that short-term solution, we reduce the amount of people who die, we reduce the amount of farmland that gets grazed and is unable to be used later, we reduce the amount of land and economies that are destroyed. That was the single most important thing for the most vulnerable states in this debate, the states who have been at civil war for years waiting for the UN to come, the states where people were dying every day, those are the people that we help. Finally, in the last 30 seconds, just going to explain why it's a good thing when states don't send in their own militaries. That is to say that we prefer that when the US gets involved, they do it through a second party rather than actively sending their own troops. That is because, firstly, often the direct presence of the US troops actively escalates the conflict. Given the history of all the bad involvement that they've done, people are often likely to be very opposed to US troops. They're unlikely to work with them, and that's therefore likely to make things sort of be a lot worse and prolong that conflict even further. Comparatively, a mercenary group is a much more neutral force. You know that they're only there for money. You're less likely to be ideologically angry at them. But secondly and crucially, often having US troops there trying to stabilize things actively does really bad things for the region. In the comparative, we think that this likely looks like the PMC entering first, dealing with the conflict aspect of it, and then the peacekeepers and the UN come in and are able to actually provide solutions. That was far better than the US Army trying to do it themselves, where they've historically done that in a lot of bad ways. And the impact of this being that you get far more long-term stability in those states, and that's also really good. So practical choice.
Tell you that intervention is great in the case that CG wants to tell you that reckless intervention is even better because it's fast, and in the case that OO brings you some good work on accountability but still maintains that intervention is inherently like a good thing in climates, that is the reason why CO must win this debate, because we win on all three of these metrics by arguing today that like just any form of intervention is something that we typically don't want, but in the case that it has to happen under the metrics of the UN. So, 3 things in this speech. First of all, why PMCs and private intervention actors are likely going to be terrible, who they're likely going to be hired by and what this looks like, and then why, even if we're considering that they're good or maybe they're not as terrible as you think, why intervention in itself is awful and why it has continued to have frightful effects on all stakeholders involved. So firstly, why exactly, what do we get at GovBench that tells us that these actors are likely going to be good? Well, we hear that they have an incentive to make money. From opening, we hear that this means that they are going to be risk averse, or they're going to sort of target the best people. And from Gov, we hear that they're going to be risk averse and they want to minimise deaths in order to avoid costs. What we say to this is, first of all, that they have to be hired in the first place. This sort of this integrates my second point, which is who specifically are these people likely going to be hired by? We think that in the case that they are expensive and they are going to be only accessible to more elite states, we think that in the case that they're being hired by the US, notably, US has historically had weird motives with regards to intervening in conflicts that has just typically caused the nature of that has completely misrepresented the nature of conflicts and just caused more and more grievances in that region. We point specifically to Mali, where UN peacekeepers only intervened in Mali following Blackwater's presence in the region, and we noted that this capacity for intervention was completely misunderstood the nature of the crime and caused the actual rebels and just caused more violence because a third party was unnecessarily intervening. So we think that in the case that the US is hiring these actors, it's likely going to be terrible because they have just no understanding of what the true nature of the conflict is and how the true nature of the conflict is going to be resolved. We think that in the case that potentially they're smaller PMCs, we think that in the case that they can't afford these larger PMCs, the quality is going to be just 10 times worse. They tell you that because of markets and things like that, the quality is inherently going to be good. We note that the fact is that these the troops have to be hired in the first place. What do we think that these smaller PMCs who do we think they're most going to be appealing to? More authoritarian or dictatorship countries. We think that in these cases they have no reason to have good incentives. We think that in the case that they want to make money, the way that these parties who just have terrible motives, the way that these parties are going to be influenced is by the number of deaths or the greatest impacts that we have. We think that there was no sufficient mechanisms to tell you that in the case that these PMCs were smaller, they weren't going to employ tactics such as asymmetric warfare that have such horrible consequences. And so we think that in the case that these countries that can't afford larger PMCs are hiring these PMCs, it's just going to avoid in so many more deaths. As CG wanted to tell you, it was the biggest impact in this debate. Working on a little bit more of CG's material, they wanted to tell you first of all that faster solutions are great, and noting that the UN is really slow. We first we have 2 main responses to this. First of all, that bureaucracy is kind of good, and a lot of the time it's necessary for discussion. We know that there are implicit biases in the UN and things that prevent great discussion from happening. But in the case that discussion is actually happening, at least these countries are having a voice about or have the capacity to have a voice about what the actual nature of their conflict is about, what they think that the best mechanisms about going about that are about. We think that the capacity for discussion in this same sense doesn't exist on GovBench, and that's why we went on that clash. We secondly think that they wanted to tell you that this hard and fast intervention is going to be great. We tell you reckless intervention is so unlikely to be great. As I've characterised to you, the fact that intervention, who this intervention is going to be used by, as I POI'd at opening Gov, is likely to be good. I'll take it in a sec. We think that the capacity for reckless intervention is going to be just so much worse. We just don't want countries naively intervening in conflicts where they see fit, immediately where they see, where they think this is good. Pointing notably to Libya with R2P, we think that this lack of consideration of the intervention is going to be, it's just so much worse. I'll take one from opening.
Is it a good thing that the international community sat on their hands and absolved themselves of responsibility by sending under-resourced UN forces when hundreds of thousands of people were being killed in Rwanda?
No, so as I pointed to in Mali, this is just like blatantly incorrect, because as I pointed to in cases such as Mali, like when UN peacekeepers were, and like over and over again, this has shown that when UN peacekeepers were like involved, or like PMCs, and like as stimulated by like businesses such as Blackwater, in the case that these things existed, like adding a third party to a conflict is just never something that's good, that is going to be good, particularly when the motives of these like businesses are just so flawed. So like on like the main extension here today is why exactly intervention is so much bad. What we told you today is that this is like operating in our like kind of best case scenario where, in our like worst case, where we think that like peacekeeping is going to continue to, moving on. So, pointed to Mali and Libya, the fact that the US and Western intervention has like so typically had the capacity for violence and deployed people who just don't have the best interests of that state at hand. We think like pointing to openings work on the lack of accountability, this just like results in far more violence. We know that like in the Syria conflict, what we've seen is that a lot of rebel groups have been easily misidentified by intervening businesses. They wanted to tell you at GovBench that like they were going to be like more, for whatever reason, have like better incentives to, or like going to be better troops, and therefore are going to be more easily able to like identify these people. We tell you that like historically this hasn't happened, and particularly with like foreign intervention. And so we just like, and we think that like this capacity for more degrees of separation, especially as like they wanted to tell you was a good thing, like even further reduces this capacity for accountability. We think like on this point, like as I pointed to, in the examples, the capacity to intervene in like the principles of self-determination of these states is a particularly bad thing. We think that this leads to more ethnic conflict with a third party involved, so the deaths of more troops, which is awful. We tell you that intervention may be that intervention is going to just like be far worse in this case scenario, and the case that it's going to be happening. That's why you have to vote as CEO.
It's because we are the only team that does not depend on the murky waters of whether or not private military contractors are good or bad. All we simply need is all the mechanisms given to you by both opening teams on why having private military contractors encourages states to intervene more in conflicts and to promote essentially more conflict. When we have that more intervention, when we are able to prove that that's such a bad thing in and of itself, independent of whether or not private military contractors are a good thing, then we have won this debate. Two more things to come in this speech. Firstly, a little bit more analysis on work on who hires and what the intervention actually looks like, because frankly, the responses we've been given here are completely insufficient. And then more whipping even the material we gave you at member on why it's always bad. We were only, so Eva told you how we could see private military contractors hired by basically everyone, that there will be small authoritarian states who want to hire private military contractors to do things that they would get their militaries sometimes to do, and that you also see big countries like the US hiring private military contractors. Just to briefly engage with the characterization we got from both government teams. Opening government tells us that it's only going to be big Western liberal democracies hiring private military countries, and the only real reason for this is because they're the only ones with the capital to afford that. Obviously, that's not true when they tell you that private military contractors are cheaper than the militaries of these countries. That means that any country that has a military, if they can afford their military, they can afford Wagner Group, because the Wagner Group's cheaper, by their own analysis. So we just don't think that stands. We think that means our claim is perfectly valid there. CG gives you a conflicting interpretation. They tell you that that these are going to be hired by small countries to deal with small conflicts happening either internally or in their region, which is which we think is likely to happen for conflicts in their region. So we have those having dealt with those characterizations, basically, our main point is everyone hires private military contractors, and everyone's able to do that. Then the other thing to deal with here is what these interventions actually look like. And once again, we have two conflicting characterizations from each half of the government bench. The first half tells us that it's only going to be when there's a really clear good and bad, moral, we're going to intervene in Ukraine, we're going to intervene in Rwanda, we're never going to intervene anywhere else. Obviously, this just doesn't stand. Firstly, because the use of normal military to intervene happens more in other a wider range of other examples than it happens in just these extreme cases and the status quo. At the point at which you're more likely to intervene, you're probably more likely to intervene in some morally grey cases. And when we're able to tell you that there are authoritarian states, smaller states that are misbehaving, that we don't trust to be good actors, who are willing to intervene at the point of closing, at which closing government implicitly tells you that as well, when it's small countries resolving internal conflicts or resolving conflicts in their neighbouring region, then there is a clear incentive for intervention in more morally grey, in less conflicting examples. Now, the only reason any government team gives us for why this intervention would ever be a good thing is that, where this intervention would ever be a good thing is essentially because it shortens wars that otherwise would be longer, or prevents human rights abuses that would otherwise occur. And we have a few things to say here. Firstly, we think that it's unclear why exactly the intervention you're getting on their side of the house is going to be specifically in the case of preventing extreme human rights abuses, why that's going to be such an amazing thing that happens exclusively on opening government's side. We think that that intervention happens already in the status quo. We were given a whole lot of reasons for you to believe that at opening opposition. But then, even if that is the characterization of the intervention, even if we take the government at their best case, then we still think that intervention is probably a bad thing in most cases. No, thank you. Because we don't think the average case of this intervention happening is actually going to be, oh, there's a genocide happening. If we don't put in UN peacekeepers or we don't put in a paramilitary group, then the genocide will happen and there's nothing we can do about it. We think it's far more likely that you're looking at some sort of low level of ethnic violence, or you're looking at some level of political oppression, which, yes, are obviously bad things, and obviously we don't like them very much, and maybe there's even some principled benefit to standing up and opposing them, but that will never stack up against you brought in a third party from a foreign country, from a foreign power, that, as we told you at EVA, no thank you, does not understand the conflict you're in, does not understand the country you're in, and is going to actively make this worse and prolong it. I'll take the point from closing if I can still have it.
Sure. Don't you think a terrorist group going through your country, killing your people and destroying your farms with an ideological incentive to win at all costs is going to be far more reckless and violent than a PMC who has to maintain their reputation to get hired the next time?
Right, but you already have an army. So, you already have your own military. There is no, the only reason you're hiring a PMC is to do something that you wouldn't get your military to do, either because your military is if it's something your military won't do, then, or is incapable of doing, it's probably because your PMC is you're hiring because you're getting Wagner Group specifically because they're not accountable, specifically because they're willing to go around and kill civilians to get rid of your terrorist group in a way that your military is not, because it's your own military. But once again, we also just don't think that's the average case that these military companies are being used in, because as we told you in the entire opening half told you, you're specifically promoting more intervention to occur. That's a scenario where your intervention is already occurring. We have to be, the case that government has to defend is one where they're specifically intervening in scenarios where otherwise they wouldn't. We think that the massive amount of violence and the massive amount of long-term conflict you cause, as well as the principal harm of taking away inherent self-determination things that we've all told you at EVA, because of that massive amount of increased violence, a massive amount of increased long-term warfare that you cause on their side uniquely for more intervention, we are so proud to oppose it.